When people try to understand the rise and fall of civilizations, they normally automatically jump to the Greeks and the Romans. In some ways, it's psychologically scarring to see everything wonderful and beautiful they left behind, whether the Colosseum, Iliad, or modern drama, in that we see so much human character and grandeur in them, but we also have to realize our own mortality in that just like them, we will become historical ruins at some point. This video attempts to be an honest look at the Greeks and the Romans. The classical world's one of those eras in history that we look at through the most modern biases and lenses, and so I'm going to try to strip that away to see them as they really were. We're going to go over how they formed, what made them so special and successful, and finally, what did them in. Classical mythology is full of epic heroes, quests, and monsters, and you can fight in similar conflicts in Raid Shadow Legend. Raid Shadow Legends is a turn-based squad combat game where you assemble a team of epic heroes to fight monsters, collect the shards of the souls of dead warriors, and defeat the Dark Lord. It's free to play, and the game's consistently updated to add new features to enhance your experience. Speaking of monsters and Dark Lords, Raid is a new monster to add to its roster of foes, the HYDRA. A superpowered clan boss, each of the HYDRA's heads has its own abilities, making it one of the most formidable foes Raid has. It's a boss fight and a crazy battle puzzle rolled into one. Raid's also giving away a super limited edition champion to every player in the game. Some of you may recognize him already. It's esports legend and Navi superstar Simple. Between now and January 28th, 2022, Simple's limited edition champion is available for free for both new and old players in Raid Shadow Legends. If you love free stuff, high fantasy strategy games, and epic monsters, then Raid Shadow Legends is a game for you. There's no better time to get started as well. Hit the link in the description or scan my QR code and you'll get an epic champion Vergus, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, and 1 XP boost and 1 ancient shard. So you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. This video is going to look at both Italy and Greece, since both of them parallel the other's development in some pretty important ways. As I've said before, when we divide or add up civilizations, there's always a lot of controversy. Like how Latin Americans are pissed off I don't include them in Western civilization, or how I divided Islamic civilization into 3 parts. I don't want to waste your time going into all this methodology, so here's a text wall. However, it will make this video clunky in a lot of ways, in that I'll try to go into the life cycle of both Greek and Roman civilization at the same time. The Greeks and Romans both started out as peoples with similar geographies and cultures, but then became even more culturally intermeshed by contact with the other. However, the Romans and Greeks hit the same stages of their life cycles centuries apart, with Greece becoming decadent in the 4th century BC, Roman Italy in the 2nd century BC, and Roman Gaul in the 3rd century AD. This will make this story more complicated, but also more interesting. In the same way that modern Western Orthodox and Islamic civilization came out of the Dark Age that went after the fall of Rome, classical civilization alongside a few others like Hebrew, Phoenician, and Indian came out of the Dark Age that happened after the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations in the 12th century BC. This was an epic historic event that we'll only barely get into, but long story short was a combination of variables including climate change, barbarian invasion, and social collapse that toppled the seemingly impregnable Bronze Age governments that lasted for centuries in that part of the world. This all happens in a 20-year period as well. It would be the equivalent of if every major country in Europe, with the exception of maybe Britain, collapsed in a 20-year period. After this hurricane, pieces of flotsam and broken houses from previous cultures were brought together to form Latin and Greek cultures. For the Greeks, there were 5 big cultural influences: the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Dorians, pre-Indo-European inhabitants, and Phoenicians. For the briefest rundown, the Minoans were an Indo-European kingdom on the island of Crete from around 2000 BC to 1400 BC. The best way to describe them is that there was a trajectory for Bronze Age societies that ran from being originally egalitarian, effeminate, magic-based societies run by ceremonial priest-kings. However, as warfare became bloodier and harsher and demanded more from societies, they shifted to patriarchal, militaristic god-king nations. However, Crete being an island was able to escape this trajectory in the same way that Britain escaped the absolutism that took over the European continent in the 17th century and was allowed to become more democratic. We don't know a lot about Minoan civilization, but We can gather that it was a pseudo-parliamentary system that had a certain degree of human rights, wasn't overly militaristic, had an industrious and mercantile population, and treated women with respect. They operated a naval empire in the Aegean in which surrounding regions adopted their culture. The parallels to Britain run pretty close. A lot of the things that made classical civilization special or apart from the Middle Eastern societies came from the Minoans. Things like a natural sense of beauty in art rather than the blocky art mammoth styles from the Near East, or a sense of the worth of the human individual rather than merely as a pawn for some king or god. However, the Minoans never fully militarized, which meant the Mycenaeans, or an Indo-European people from mainland Greece, were able to conquer them, destroy Minoan culture, and turn the native population into serfs. The Mycenaeans were in a lot of ways pretty similar to the Vikings, with a manly, raiding, aristocratic pirate culture that took cultural elements from the pre-existing Minoan society. These are the people from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the historian Will Durant described them as moths around the flame of the dying Minoan culture. However, the Bronze Age Dark Ages hit Greece and destroyed urbanized civilization, and then another Indo-European tribal group named the Dorians came down from modern Bulgaria, forced the Mycenaeans, who then became named the Ionians, into the islands and peninsulas of the Aegean, while the Dorians settled the valleys of central Greece. The Dorians didn't know how to write or work in stone, which set Greek civilization back for centuries. When we later look at the struggle between the ocean-based Athenians and the land-based Spartans, we're looking at a pattern going back centuries to the seafaring and more culturally sensitive Ionians and the savage, aggressive, land-loving Dorians. The Dorians and Ionians would later mix to form the Greeks. When Greece was stuck in the Dark Age, it was pulled out by contact with the Phoenicians. In the Bronze Age collapse, the edges of civilization like Turkey, Greece, and India were completely lost, but civilization survived from the Fertile Crescent, and so the Phoenicians, based out of modern Lebanon, became the first middlemen and navigators of the Mediterranean. They set up colonies around the region, with the largest being Carthage in North Africa. However, they reintroduced the basis of civilization to the Greeks. This is why our alphabets derive from a Phoenician origin, or how the Greeks started using money again. Many Greek gods were derived from Semitic ones, like Aphrodite from Ishtar or Persephone from Ninursa. The Phoenicians even brought the rudiments of Greek science, which came originally from Babylonian astrology. Finally, all of these groups built on top of the ground soil of whatever groups inhabited Greece before the Indo-Aryan conquests. We know almost nothing about these people, but we can sometimes see through the veil of history to make out faint outlines. We'll cover some of these later, but one of the most important things to keep in mind with all of classical civilization is that its aristocratic character stems from the conquest by the Indo-Aryans. If you take away anything from this video, it would be that classical civilization was fundamentally aristocratic, and this was largely because, unlike Northern Europe where the Indo-Aryans genocided the native population, and ruler and ruled were the same ethnicity, in Southern Europe the Indo-Aryans became the ruling class and installed oppressive serf states on top of the native population. This model didn't survive all of classical civilization, but its influence is nevertheless paramount throughout it. The Italians had a lot less influences going into them than the Greeks, and you don't have the Minoans, and basically it's just Indo-Europeans conquering the native population. In the same way the Minoans, followed by the Mycenaeans, followed by the Dorians, conquered Greece, you had a couple Indo-Aryan invasions of Italy, but we just don't know a lot about those guys. You should keep in mind that the indigenous inhabitants of Greece and Italy were pretty similar, as were the Indo-Aryan conquerors. Take how people say that Jupiter and Zeus or Artemis and Diana are interchangeable. That's because they're actually different gods. It's just that those gods were so fundamentally similar due to the cultures not being that different that they in time became interchangeable. Civilization was brought to Italy from the Near East in the form of the Etruscans, whose language and genetics suggest that they came from Turkey, which lines up pretty well with the Roman myth in the Aeneid that their ancestors were Trojans who came from Turkey. However, in the same way that the Phoenicians brought a lot of civilization by boat from the Middle East to Greece, the Greeks did that in turn to Italy. The fundamental political organization in the first half or so of classical civilization was the city-state. These basically developed as oversized villages that never formed into centralized countries. The major transition that allowed democracy to occur in the classical world was that towards the Phalanx, or a block of spearmen. Until around 600 BC in both Italy and Greece, the main form of warfare was aristocratic horsemen who lorded over largely unarmed peasantries, resulting in deeply unequal kingdoms. Political power and inequality are predicated so heavily upon the methods of warfare as to be predictive. Thus, when the main form of warfare changed from small groups of horsemen to large blocks of spearmen, the society was democratized on both a political and economic level. In fact, you could understand almost all of Greek and Italian society from roughly 600 BC to 400 BC according to the Phalanx. Monarchies in the traditional sense really didn't survive anywhere. You had a bunch of different models which you can read about here, but the continuing thread between Athens, Sparta, Rome, etc., a situation in which those that could afford armor to fight, which normally was little upwards of 10% of the population, were given the vote, well, the lower classes were often given nearly worthless votes or were slaves. Modern people often like to shit on the classical world for not being progressive enough, but you have to keep in mind just how revolutionary they were for their own era. This was a world divided between god-kings and barbarian tribes, for Christ's sake. This was a society in real terms built around the Phalanx. In the same way that militaries care a lot about discipline because counting on your buddies to maintain the shield wall is a matter of life and death, these were societies that regulated the individual's life in every possible way. We often mistake democracy in the classical world for freedom, but freedom was a concept invented in the Middle Ages, and in truth, these were remarkably unfree societies. As you'll see, the individual was freer in despotic Persia than in Athens or Sparta. Here are some examples. In most ancient Greek city-states, it was illegal to be a bachelor. There were state-mandated political events and religious ceremonies to keep track of, which added up to a significant amount of time. As well as this, there were laws against sumptuary or dressing or eating too nicely. Someone once did a survey of the amount of time your average Athenian citizen would spend in political meetings, and it actually added up to be a full-time job, which was allowable because slaves did most of the work. These were societies with no sense of property or individual rights. If the city wanted to take your property, since you belonged to the city, so did your property, and so they could just have it. If people didn't like you, they could ostracize you and forever banish you from the city just for that reason. The individual was viewed as an atom that belonged to the state with no outside identity. In Sparta, this was taken to extremes, with the state taking boys at the age of 7 and raising them in military camps where they lived for the rest of their lives, only being able to see their wives rarely until past age 40. If a Spartan woman wanted to breed with a strapping young male, the husband was legally not allowed to refuse, as children belonged to the state, and as a eugenics measure, the healthiest should breed the most. There was once a quip that the Spartans would say, "We're the freest people in the world and that no one rules us," to which the reply was, "You're the only people who have enslaved yourselves." The sense of brotherhood among the Phalanx and democracy allowed a large degree of cultural unity, which let heroic actions like fighting off the Persians to the famous stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. The Greeks could do absolutely incredible stuff like Xenophon's March to the 10,000 or controlling the Mediterranean's trade, since they had such a remarkable degree of cultural unity and strength that came from the city-state. To continue our connection between democracy and the Phalanx, as the Phalanx became less and less effective due to the implementation of horsemen and archers, so did Greek democracy vanish. In the same way that the state controlled the individual, the patriarch or the oldest father of the family totally controlled the people under his purview. Individualism was invented with Christianity, and you see the results of this in that the father was totally justified in letting an unneeded child die if the family didn't want it. In classical Greece, women had no education and rights, and often lived in the home, forbidden from interacting with the rest of the world, similarly to how women are treated by the Taliban today. The main economic form of the classical world was slavery, and the main cultural glue that held society together was interpersonal relationships. As a counterpoint, across Western history, the main economic driver has been capitalism, in that someone will make a business and incentivize other people, normally who have no kin relation to them whatsoever, to work for them in exchange for money. In the collectivist classical world, however, there would be a patriarch who would accumulate slaves and dependents to work for him in whatever position as craftsmen, accountants, farmers, etc., and they'd produce goods that the rest of the economy needed. The classical world was extremely interpersonal, in which everything was based upon a relationship. An example of this is that a baker wouldn't just sell bread to the free market. He'd get a wealthy client to produce bread for. In this relationship, in which the baker would be the inferior, he would be expected to, say, produce extra bread at lower cost for the patriarch's big party, and do favors whenever necessary, but also could call on the patriarch for funding if his bakery burned down. This may sound weird to us, but this sort of thing's how most of the cultures across history and even much of the world today operate. However, this system meant that a couple families and wealthy interests held a tremendous amount of power in later classical society. It varied a lot between Athens, which is extremely egalitarian in the classical period, and so your average Pednos could get political power, to 100 BC Rome, which was one of the most unequal societies in all of history. This is why a handful of families were elected into power in the Roman Republic. It's also why in Rome Total War the Roman Republic split between the Julii, Scipii, and Brutii, because after a certain point, these families got powerful enough they did act like countries in their own right. The Athenian male citizen population of around 30,000 in a single city over a 50-year period invented our underlying concepts behind the art, architecture, drama, literature, history, philosophy, and a bunch of other stuff. This gets even more dramatic when you think of nations that often have histories going back thousands of years with millions of inhabitants that you struggle to find a single invention, conqueror, or philosophic breakthrough from. How the hell was this possible? A misconception we often have when we study classical civilization is by just looking at Athens for that 50-year period. I remember reading a 600-page history of ancient Greece that spent 450 pages on that one topic. This really is unfair, and I'll try to rectify that in this video, but you've got to give the Athenians props. So what went right in Athens? The way the history of progress works is that things stagnate for a while until a series of factors come together that let lightning strike for a short period of time in which stupendous results occurred. This happens in Athens due to a confluence of 7 variables. Number 1. Merchant seafaring culture. The Greeks traded and settled around the whole Mediterranean, and Athens was the hub of that trade network. That meant that ideas and knowledge from everyone showed up in Athens. Number 2. Democracy. Athens was a society where people were expected to talk about political issues and the reasons for making decisions rather than having a god-emperor dictate them. And number 3. Confidence. The Greeks had just defeated the far larger Persian Empire with unbelievable odds, which gave them an insane degree of confidence to do incredible stuff. Number 4. Slavery. Slaves did all the real work in Athens, leaving the small citizen population to think about abstract ideals all the time. Number 5. Geographically centralized. The citizen body lived in downtown Athens rather than being geographically sprawled across the countryside, meaning people were talking and communicating a lot. Number 6. The decline in religion. This was an era of widespread agnosticism in which people didn't believe in the old gods, and so people were looking for new answers. And number 7. Belief in abstract laws. Unlike most people of their time who anthropomorphized reality by saying, say, that the sun or ocean was a god with emotions, the Greeks had the Indo-Aryan belief that reality itself is an impersonal order or fate that even the gods are beholden to. This allowed the construction of a logical world order. The comparison to India is extremely apt here. In India, Indo-Aryan conquerors, very similar to those that conquered Greece, conquered very different local populations with also very different geographies. You see the same aristocratic society and the same Indo-Aryan philosophic underlying view, but it ended up in very similar yet very different places. In Greece, which was divided between city-states, philosophy became based around solving real-world political problems. A person's identity was exclusively political. In India, there were centralized city-states, but they lost to giant mega-kingdoms which dispossessed the native aristocracies who then went into mysticism to escape the political world. Although Indian thinking was extremely logical, it never manifested in science but instead in religion. The classical world eventually thought the material world was all that existed, the Indian that the material world was an illusion. The interesting thing is both civilizations kind of drove themselves into a civilizational rut from those thought processes. The main contribution the Greeks gave to the intellectual world was they were the first society ever to put the creative power of human genius above tradition. For the Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, or Chinese, one was meant to follow a tradition to the utmost, and that's what was inherently good. For the Greeks and Romans, they still held tradition in a high regard, but also put humans on a field similar to the gods, in that humans could create amazing things that held merit without a god's approval. A great example of this is that the Greeks made their gods look like humans. Meanwhile, the Asian societies made them look like supermen. The Greeks put the human drama at the center of their plays and stories, while the Asian societies had mere lists of events, since society existed to serve gods and their representations on earth as the emperors. The Greek philosophic jump was that man was capable of being a great entity in of itself, often in opposition to cruel and wicked gods, and that our rational abilities, our highest virtue, was their greatest achievement. The Greek ability in logic was astounding. The pre-Socratic philosophers in Miletus were able to figure out atom theory, the basis of evolution, and heliocentrism. The Greeks figured out mechanical elementary computers and steam engines. Classical civilization was described by the legendary German historian Oswald Spengler as Apollonian, in that it seemed to try to reach a rationally perfect balance. Their philosophy was entirely rational, or their city-states' legal codes were designed to tame the individual. For opposing positions, Western Christian civilization's Faustian, or seeks the truth above all else, or Semitic civilization thinks that one should unquestionably submit to God. This classical insistence upon rational balance allowed some of their greatest achievements, but as Aristotle said, one's greatest strength when pushed to an extreme will become one's downfall. Starting a little bit in Athens after Plato, but ending with the fall of the Roman Empire, classical civilization was gradually eaten alive by a slow-moving cancer. That cancer was over-rationalization. To understand how too much rationality applied in the wrong places killed classical civilization, we have to first look at its original religious model. The organizing cultural bulwark of the city-state and the family, or the most powerful social and economic unity of classical civilization, was religion. Every family would have their own gods, with their own rituals that had to be followed to the letter in order not to displease the ancestors and family gods. Greeks and Italians in 700 BC seem to have literally believed that the fires in their hearth and their houses had gods that needed to be pleased to give the family good luck, and if a person wasn't properly buried in their tombs, they'd wander the underworld forever in displeasure. The rights to worship these gods were passed on from father to son through the generations. In the same way these families had gods, so did the city-states. Each city had a cult of their local god whose ceremonies had to be respected and followed to the letter. The gods of those areas were viewed like tigers and that they had to be kept at bay with sacrifices, and so this was more done out of fear than any real love. The city gods were passed on from father to son again, and so this meant classical civilization couldn't assimilate foreigners when they were at the city-state level of development. Around 500 BC across all of civilized Eurasia, people stopped believing in traditional gods, which resulted in a wellspring of new belief structures and religions. In Asia, these largely satisfied people's needs, which is why Buddhism, Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, and Taoism are still fully fledged religions today. However, in the classical world, only the rational side of the human spirit was tapped into, leaving out the emotional and sensory. The main problem here is that people really don't do things for rational reasons. Game theory studies have found that the population is split into three demographics: 20% who are free riders and try to game the system, 20% who are saints and always try to give into the system and help people, and more or less who are 60% and do what everyone else is doing. Society's ability to succeed is largely based on getting the moralists and the free riders to contribute to the system as much as possible. The problem here is that with pure rationality in an agnostic world, people don't have incentives to do things that are good for the community and not them as individuals. This is why non-religious societies continually fail across history. You see this writ across the classical world in its entirety. Without a decency that's given to human life, you saw horrific atrocities like the Athenian genocide against Melos, justified literally by might makes right in a speech the Athenians gave before butchering the native inhabitants, Caesar's rape of Gaul, which killed 2 million people, or a third of Gaul's population, or massive slave populations. As the societies lost religion, they lost the will to fight, breed, and do all the things that are demanded of individuals as part of collectives. If the end of the classical world was caused by anything, it was declining birth rates. Both the Roman and Greek republics saw declining civilian populations as barbarian populations skyrocketed. You need to view the main flaw of classical civilization as that as rationality was given predominance, everything else was pushed to the wayside. An example of which is relations with women, in which women's ability to maintain society through childbirth was given no respect, thus resulting in collapsing birth rates. The classical world thought slavery was natural, since those who supposedly couldn't think, or slaves, should serve those who could, thus opening them up for full-time jobs of refinement and logic. The main problem with classical science was that it put far too much emphasis on the rational over the practical, since a logically correct argument was viewed as more real than the real world, which, according to Platonic philosophy, was just a pale imitation of the immutable forms. This meant that the classical world thought heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones, even though a 30-second trial would have proven that wrong. Alternatively, that applying science for technology was crass. The Greeks invented the steam engine and computer and never really used them. The brilliant scientist Archimedes apologized for using his understanding of the sun to make cool mirror weapons that could burn ships, since making it practical solely dishonor as a scientist. Something important to look at is that as the cults of the classical gods weakened and the citizen class became agnostic, the lower classes fell in love with Asiatic mystery cults that had no relation to loyalty to the state and were often illegal. Christianity was the apex of this trend in that it was an international cult that said the followers' loyalty was to their god rather than to the state, which horrified classical governments who thought that without religion, the base of society and government would fall apart. Christianity was so successful since it was everything the classical world failed at. In a world in which millions were horribly mistreated slaves, in which the rich made statues of themselves and the emperors turned themselves into gods, a world in which rationality was misused for evil, Christianity made an emotional assistance to women and the poor, or the have-nots, to an emotional philosophy built around humility and decency. Christianity combined with the classical world's rationality to create a powerful combination for later Western civilization. There was a second cancer that we've covered indirectly that ate classical civilization as well, and that was slavery. The dominant elite social class across classical civilization were aristocratic slave owners, and as is the case whenever one group becomes dominant, the faults of that social class manifest in horrible ways across the total society. Slavery has deleterious effects upon economies and societies. For one, it can balloon inequality as it's hard for free labor to undercut slave labor, and so social mobility collapses. This is what happened in the ancient Greek city-states. There was so much competition between rich and poor citizen classes that under many circumstances the Romans were welcomed in as conquerors with open arms so that the other side in their local civil wars wouldn't win. These were often really interesting and depressing conflicts in which there was actually a strong communist movement. One of my favorite lines in all of history is from an ancient Greek comedy in which a communist is pontificating upon a utopia in which everything is shared, to which someone asks him who will work, to which his reply is, the slaves, of course. The Roman Republic was wiped out by inequality as well, in that they had some of the highest rates ever in history. In both Greece and Rome, inequality killed social trust and allowed tyrannies to arise out of the chaos that came afterwards. We see the terrible effects of slavery in economics, in which farming for the greatest efficiency just wasn't seen as important. The Greeks and Romans both heavily degraded their soil qualities and were operating at far lower agricultural efficiencies than they could have, even knowing methods to improve soil quality, but never using them since slavery creates no incentive structures towards efficiency, providing another reason for why the classical world never used the steam engine. A very apt example of how common slavery was and how massively negative the effects were was that pirates were allowed to operate in a really horrible way off the south coast of Turkey for over 100 years since the Roman elite let them because they provided slaves for Italy. The Romans had immense military power at the time and could wipe out entire kingdoms, but their merchant classes weren't powerful enough to overpower the slave class's desire for more slaves. The Romans, in fact, maintained a conquest state in which they would purposely have vague laws around conquered peoples for over a century in order to make slaving more easy. The massive disparities in income created massive decadence that rotted out the elite classes. As an example, a big motivator for young men for all of history to improve themselves is sex. And so whenever you let young men have as much sex as they want without having them improve themselves first, they spoil and become rotten. When we look at figures like Caligula and Nero and the like, who did unspeakable decadences as Roman emperors, or dinners with peacocks, or driving whole species extinct for the gladiatorial games, this is the process of decadence. This process of decadence rotted different parts of the classical ruling elite at different times in different centuries. A big reason that a lot of the Mediterranean world in areas like southern Italy, Greece, Egypt, and the like have such high corruption and wastage even today is that they haven't recovered trust levels from how bad classical slavery was. Wow, this is a crazy video. We're simultaneously at the fall of Rome in 400 AD and haven't even reached Alexander the Great in 350 BC, but the rot that killed classical civilization took a long time to spread and had a series of setbacks, like Augustus's reforms. It's better to view it as a creative tension of yin and yang in which a positive side of classical civilization with amazing individuals, art, philosophy, and the like was built off agnosticism and slavery in the negative side. The balance held for a long, long time, but eventually gave out. An interesting thing in the alternate history space is that people generally think that if the Roman Empire had never fallen, technology would be more advanced. But as a person whose historical speciality is the era around the fall of Rome, I can tell you that by the time the empire fell, it was doing far more ills than good, and classical civilization was clearly dying and decayed. An example of this is that height and health actually went up in Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Taxes were so bad as the empire fell that elites actually left the cities and lived alone in the countryside in order to evade taxes. By the time the empire fell, it was so decayed and collapsed that it's pretty close to the Imperium of Mankind from Warhammer 40k. The Greek city-states killed each other due to infighting in the Peloponnesian Wars between the seafaring Athenian Empire and the land-based Spartan Empire, as well as the process of Apollonianism and slavery described above. Afterwards, large empires were formed by Macedon and Rome. Historian Peter Turchin did an analysis of empires across history and found they were all formed by a multi-century trans-ethnic conflict which created a powerful us versus them spirit which powers empire. For the city-states in Greece, they unified into two big blocks of Sparta and Athens due to fighting off the Persians, but that wasn't long enough to unify those city-states into a common empire. However, Macedon and Rome were both in the frontiers with Celtic peoples. The Celts are really underrated in how kick-ass they were during the Iron Age. They nearly wiped out Rome and reached into the middle of Greece alongside colonizing central Turkey. The Celts would routinely muster armies in the tens of thousands, and if you were on the other side of their charge, you had to really have your act together or you'd be conquered and die. This created a profound sense of patriotism and kept inequality under control. The Macedonians were able to unify Greece through the grand mission of conquering Persia, which they somehow pulled off due to Alexander the Great's genius, in addition to a very well-created military, and the Persians really not having a good counter to heavy infantry. Alexander's conquests stand as a remarkable event and created Greek colony states in the Middle East. After Alexander's death, these divided among his generals. This video purposely prioritizes the cultural heart of classical civilization rather than the appendages of military events and colonies and that stuff, but these colonial states were really remarkable. Alexandria in Egypt became a new, extremely bright center of Greek culture. Meanwhile, several thousand miles away, the Greeks established a state in northern Afghanistan that lasted for 150 years. Based out of Afghanistan, the Greeks launched attacks into India, where they nearly conquered all the way to Bangladesh, as well as possibly converting to Buddhism. Greek influence wasn't short-lived in Asia either. The British were very surprised to see Greek-like sculpture styles in western Pakistan. Likewise, you had cults of Hercules in northern Iran, and even after the Persians regained political power and the Romans conquered the region, Greek culture remained dominant until after the birth of Christ. This was since Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization had become so aged as to approach senility, and Persia hadn't had the time yet to develop a compelling civilization for its whole empire, which let classical civilization exploit the vacuum. If we're talking about Greek colonies, something that I really should get to, but I haven't had the time to so far, is that the Greeks had been colonizing the coastline in the Mediterranean for centuries before Plato and Aristotle. The Greeks had colonies in modern Libya, France, Italy, Ukraine, and there were probably more ethnic Greeks in Italy or Turkey than there were Greeks in modern Greece itself. In effect, the most extreme parts of classical civilization were amplified in the colonies, which is normally the case with colonial anthropology. For example, some of the largest areas of Greek philosophy were in Italy and Turkey. After Alexander's conquests, the Greeks treated the local populations in the Middle East worse than the previous regimes, introducing large-scale slavery into the region. The Greeks abandoned their gods even more, taking up rationalistic philosophies like Stoicism, Platonism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism. They lived like later European colonizers would, independent and divided from the local populations. A big reason the Seleucid Empire, or the Greek Empire in the Middle East, was so weak was that it only recruited infantry from the Greek colonizing population, which was a tiny percentage. These Greek colonial states became fairly weak and so fell without much struggle to Iranian nomadic invaders and the Romans once they were put under pressure. To go over to the West, two things let the Roman Empire develop: their unspeakable grit and their ability to assimilate other cultures. As to the first point, the Romans' sheer courage is shocking, and was their main leverage in early wars. Until around 200 BC, the Romans really didn't have any military advantages over their opponents, except sheer grit. Look at the Second Punic War, where a majority of upper-class Romans died fighting the Carthaginians, and there were 3 separate battles where the Romans lost more than 60,000 men, when they only had a population of 6 million people. Major factor here is that Rome remained egalitarian and religious, or factors that allow cultures to have a lot of courage and unity for centuries after Greece did. As to the second point, this is the main dividing factor between the Romans and Greeks. The Greeks were brilliant at philosophy and science, and the Romans weren't. But the Romans were far better statesmen. Greek city-states were never good at getting people outside their city-state or ethnic group to work with them, while Rome had a massive network of allied states and was constantly assimilating foreign peoples into its culture. This meant that Rome always had more men than its opponents. The medieval Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun said that it took around 150 years for an elite to become decadent, and studies by modern historian Peter Turchin has largely found this to be true. For the Greeks, when their 150 years was up, they were largely toast. However, the Romans were extremely good at getting new elites to run their empire to revive it. People often ask why the Roman Empire fell, which isn't the right question. Almost all empires fall. The real question is, why didn't it fall so much earlier? This is since the Romans were very good at reviving themselves through new elites. The Roman Civil War was when the old Italian aristocracy had grown corrupt. While the Pax Romana was the army operated largely by Italians and Spaniards ran the country. But when that group became decadent and corrupt around 200 AD, in the east a new military elite formed under Balkan and Anatolian leadership. However, in the west, Germanic barbarians rose to leadership as the empire fell apart. Something to keep in mind with both the Macedonian and Roman empires is that their conquests ruined their home nations. In the same way that the modern Pax Americana lets the US Federal Reserve print limitless money, which creates large disturbances in the economy and American society, the glut of empire put both Greece and Rome into economic and demographic decay. The new centers that developed after that were in modern France and the Middle East, which interestingly allowed the presage and creation of later Western, Orthodox, and Islamic civilization. The final point is that classical civilization had trouble really having meaningful impact beyond the Mediterranean climate zone. Classical civilization was dependent upon wheat, wine, and olive oil, and where those couldn't grow, it both metaphorically and literally withered on the vine. In areas outside the Mediterranean, like in the Middle East and Northern Europe, classical civilization was largely islands and seas of Semitic, Iranian, and Celtic speakers. Interestingly enough, the Greek kingdom in Afghanistan was based out of a mountain region with a Mediterranean climate. I often hear the argument that classical civilization is part of Western civilization. I hope after this long video about how extremely different these civilizations are, you've been dissuaded of that. However, although classical civilization died, it had three beautiful children: Western, Orthodox, and Islamic. In the West, the Catholic Church was the organization that transferred classical civilization onto the next level, which meant its philosophy could flower most brightly there. In Orthodox civilization, the government was maintained, which meant Byzantium was the direct political descendant. Much as many people won't believe it, Islam took much of the social structure between the predominantly slave economy, the patriarchal family structure, and the seclusion of women. We often view classical civilization with rose-colored glasses today. In our study of history, certain areas are, in my opinion, treated too poorly, like I'd argue the Middle Ages, and some are treated too positively, as you've seen me argue for classical civilization. This is not to say classical civilization was bad. The classical world achieved remarkable things in so many ways that it gets hard to list them, whether intellectual, human, administrative, artistic, and it goes on. In the same way the Western world searched for truth, the classical searched for perfection, and reached it in a lot of ways, so much so that all of its descendant civilizations tried to emulate it, even up until the present. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my social media, my Patreon, where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my history of the world and cultural history of America. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.